When I reached out to Mike and sent him the schedule today, the title of this session was Digital Assets and Physical Food. And his team immediately reached out and they're like, wait a second, physical food, what does that mean? I'm like, it's lunchtime, okay? So thank you, I'm glad everybody was able to enjoy lunch. Mike, I'm thrilled to have you here. Mike Novogratz needs no introduction. Obviously Goldman to Fortress, now at Galaxy Digital, and has recreated himself and reinvented himself over and over and over again. You like to joke that you become a billionaire 3 times over and on 3 separate occasions. Mike, when you think about the world of finance, and I would broadly characterize everything that's going on as largely boring, you've managed to seek out the most interesting components of it, some of the most controversial components of it. What brings you to do that? What brings you to reinvent yourself over and over and over again?
Yeah, desperation.
Desperation?
No. Listen, I've been a macro thinker most of my career. First as a sales guy, then as a trader at Goldman Sachs, and then at Fortress. And if you step back for a second, I started my career April 1st of 1989. 89 was, in a lot of ways, the most symbolic, important year in any of our history if you're close to my age. Right? It's the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's Tiananmen Square, it's communism losing to free market capitalism. Right?
The end of history. Right?
It was the end of history. It ushered in this era of globalization, which most of us didn't pay attention to. We talked about it, but it was a huge tailwind to everything we did. But you had the Great Moderation, you had, in 1989, if you looked at who participated in the global economy, U.S., Western Europe, and like literally people participated in trade, it was 450 million people, right? Today that number is wildly over 3 billion. And so we went from this small little world where Japan, Western Europe, U.S., to this globalized world. And that created these mega trends that we rode consciously or unconsciously. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to think about what happened in that context, 2001, people looked at that was kind of a weird terrorist thing. No one thought that was a dent in this story of globalization. But 2008, the whole world fell apart. And if you look back on 2008, you could really see it was the first time we saw real cracks in the story. No one thought of it that way. We thought of it as excessive risk. Right? All these dollars that were being created were being recycled through the citadels of risk, which were New York City and London. I used to call my hedge fund M40. Right? I'd take your money and I'll invest it in all kinds of things. We were taking money from places overseas, from the Chinese and the petrodollars recycling. Satoshi wrote his white paper in 2009 when he saw the cracks and said, this is unsustainable. It's creating too much disparity of wealth, and it's going to push populist governments around the world. And so I got into crypto, not in 2009, in 2013. Someone showed me Bitcoin. And if you remember in 2012-13, we had the great European financial crisis, right? Like the second gut punch that we all suffered. And Bernanke came out with QE2. The panic around QE2 in the financial system was real, right? Paul Singer from Elliott, one of the best investors of the last 30 years, took a full-page advertisement in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal calling for now Nobel laureate Ben Bernanke to go to jail for being a traitor to our country. Like literally. I was like, Paul, you're out of your mind. And he had like 50 people sign it. There was a belief that, at least by some, and really smart people, that this was going to ignite this inflation maelstrom. And so I bought crypto thinking, now this is kind of interesting. There's a narrative that we'd have these deflationary impulses. There were libertarians and cypherpunks, and the Chinese were buying it. So I thought, enough people are buying it. It's going to go higher. The mistake I made, or maybe the blessing, I talked about it at something like this. I didn't think the press was there, and I was on literally the cover of the FT the next day. And ever since then was asked to speak about crypto. And what that did is it brought me into rooms where I had to understand how the goddamn thing worked. And as you learned, and as I met the people, I got fascinated with the technology, but mostly fascinated with the ethos of this group of people, both building Bitcoin and Ethereum, who really wanted to rebuild the financial and consumer infrastructure of the world in a way that was more transparent, more egalitarian, and sustainable. They saw the legacy financial system way back in 2013, 14 breaking. And like, it's at the end of its life. It's not going to work. And a lot of that's because of populism. And so when Trump won in 16 and Brexit happened in 15, we all were like, oh shit, globalization is over, right? It's the end of this era. How did that happen? Like, yes, globalization was good for Vietnam and China's rise from, peasants to middle class. But if you were in the working to middle class or upper middle class West, US, Europe, you got gutted. And so each of these pieces of this narrative have fed the enthusiasm for crypto, right? Crypto is a young person's business, right? So it's Gen Z and millennials really, that said, hey, our parents have screwed this up. Our grandparents have screwed this up. When I graduated from college in 1987, debt to GDP in America was 45%. Today it's 130. So grandma and grandpa spent way too much damn money. The baby boomers, George Bush, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, all born the same year. That era, the 77-year-olds who have been in power for 30 freaking years since Clinton got in power, right? Throw Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, have spent like crazy people. In that same 35 years, we were talking about this outside, the average American woman has gained 35 pounds. The average American man has gained 35 pounds. The average American woman is now 5'4", 170 pounds. We have an obesity epidemic on the watch of these great leaders, right? Inequality has gone from here to here. Our Gini coefficient is as wide as it's been in America on the watch of these leaders. And so then you think about global warming. Like, we didn't have these issues 35 years ago. Our planet wasn't convulsing on the watch of these great leaders. So if you are a young person, if you are my 22-year-old or my 19-year-old son looking up, you're like, why in God's name should I pay attention to these assholes? That is the ethos that drives crypto. That's what got me excited, because I was like, the way to stay young is hang out with young people. And the way to learn is to hang out with young people. And so what pushed me in really was not even the money, because I already had money. I'd done well at Fortress. It was the fascination that these guys were building a revolution. And if you strip away all the fraud and the frenzy and the crap that has gone on recently with crypto and went on in both the 2017 bubble and the 2021 moonshot, at the core, there really are people that are purpose-driven and revolutionary.
So when you think about
long answer, sorry about that.
No, it's a phenomenal interest, and you touched on a number of things that candidly I struggled with as I first began to re-engage with the Bitcoin community in 2020. One of the components that surprised me as a relatively affluent, upwardly middle-aged man, was the sense of despair, the sense of frustration, the anger that existed that allowed people to say some variant of, well, sure, there's problems with this, but look at the problems with the existing system, right? Something has to change. Given what's transpired in the past 2 years, where it's gone through an incredible promotional cycle that's gotten people incredibly excited, got people worked up about it as a token of economic value, as compared to what I would argue is really the revolution that you're referring to, and importantly, one of the rallying cries for Satoshi and for others in this space is this check on the leaders, the great leaders that have not led us in the right direction, right?
Crypto, well, let's separate crypto into a few buckets for a second. Right now I want to talk about Bitcoin, because Bitcoin was first. It's got one of the best brands ever created. Think about this. It's a miracle. This thing is only 14 years old, yet it's the 8th largest country on earth. 150 million people own a part of a Bitcoin. That makes it bigger than Russia, right? Bitcoin Nation is powerful. It's a group of people that on their own free will have decided to take some of their hard-earned wealth from the fruits of their labor and store it in this community that is governed by technology, that's governed by cryptography. That's kind of a miracle. It's become a store of value for those 150 million people, who include Stan Druckenmiller and Abby Johnson and Jeff Yass and Paul Tudor Jones, some of the world's best investors, and people you will never going to meet from all over the world. And so people say, well, is it a store of value or not? I was like, ask those 150 million people. Now, the price goes up and down, right? People say, well, oh, is it a good inflation hedge? I was like, if you bought it before the day before COVID, and then after COVID, they said, we're going to spray all the money into the world that like you've never seen. It went up 10x or at 6x, depending on if you bought it at 6,000 or 10,000, it went to 70,000. It's come down because finally we had a Fed governor, albeit very late, that said, I'm going to take out this big giant hammer and start beating inflation on the head because confidence is breaking down in the system. And so we now have lots of frothy assets that have sold off a lot, and they should have sold off, right? We're now moving from inflation to let's kill inflation. And Chairman Powell and the Fed are pretty outspoken about they're going to kill inflation. There was a big debate yesterday at the Robinhood conference between Paul Jones and Stevie Cohen. They going to flinch? You think they're going to flinch? They're going to flinch. Of course they'll flinch. No Fed governor has ever hiked rates with an ISM under 50, other than Paul Volcker. Is Chairman Powell going to be Paul Volcker? And even if Chairman Powell is tough, is Biden and his administration with Janet Yellen maybe being replaced by Lael Brainerd, maybe being replaced by, who knows, Larry Summers, going to say, yeah, we got to tighten the belt? Is that the progressive side of Democrats? Like when I said, you know, we lost the globalization narrative, we went from a neoliberal 25 years where the left and right didn't look that different to a neo-populist era. Donald Trump spent more money in the first 3 years of his government than any president in history. He took the budget, not the deficit, the budget, from $3 trillion to $3.9 trillion before COVID. And when asked who's going to pay for it, he, in classic Trump fashion, said, someone else can worry about it, right? So the Republican who came in as a populist said, spend, military, whatever. Biden comes in, says, well, I've got the socialist, our progressive agenda, and I got my shot, and so let's 1.8 trillion, 1.3 trillion. We were throwing trillions around like matchsticks. A trillion is 5% of GDP. 5% of GDP is usually a crisis. We were throwing around like matchsticks. And so now Bitcoin's doing what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to come down when the Fed's hiking. The question is when the Fed flinches, because they'll have to flinch at one point. They might not flinch next month, for 3 months. Does that narrative pick back up? And what we're seeing around the world is, look what happened in the UK. When confidence breaks, it's hard to get the goddamn genie back in the bottle, right? Their rates went, and they're back on their tail today. It's scary, right? I tell audiences all the time, I go to bed and I say a Hail Mary and 2 All Fathers that the stewardship of our economy is good. I don't want Bitcoin to go to 1 million, because that means we lose civil society. That means Donald Trump gets reelected and appoints some stoogie as his Secretary of Treasury. We haven't had that. Like, you might not like Steve Mnuchin, but he was a pretty straightforward guy. You might not like Janet Yellen. She's a civil servant. She's a pretty straightforward woman. We have had great stewardship of our economy. You might not agree with them all, but they've been in the middle. And when you look at Turkey, what do you think the inflation rate in Turkey is this year? Yeah, 95%. Turkish lira has lost about 95% of its value in the last 3 or 4 years. So if you're middle class, working class in Turkey, you've gotten wiped out, right? Bitcoin is a report card against that. And so people say, oh, Bitcoin's had a shitty year. I said, well, not against the lira or the yen or the pound or the euro, right? It's had a tough year against the dollar. But if there's a basket of currencies, doing fine. Yeah. And so it really has become this digital gold. And it's not for debate anymore. People say, wow, I don't believe in it. Well, you don't have to believe in it. I got 150 million people that already do. And I've got more and more on-ramps for people to buy it easier. When I first had to buy it, it was literally impossible. Now in Singapore, at DBS Bank, in your banking app, you can buy, sell, store, right on the app, the bank app. That'll happen in America soon enough. And so as more people get access and more people hear that story, like any store of value, it's just going to continue to gain adoption. And so I have great faith in the medium term in Bitcoin. The rest of crypto is a different world, using the same technology, right? You have blockchains, which are Microsoft Excel data sheets, spreadsheets, that instead of being run by one person, can be run by communities. And there's a lot of beauty in that. You can't change the grade on the report card. You can't change the ledger in a financial transaction. You can't change the contract in an artist to collector. And so that technology, provides speed, transparency, privacy, and certainty, is coming. Are we ready for prime time? Absolutely not. These things have to be more trusted. They have to be, it's funny because they're trust machines, but you got to teach people to trust the trust machine. They need to be faster. You're getting scaling solutions really quickly. The Ethereum, which will probably be the winner of the base layer of trust, now has these level 2 solutions on top of it, other blockchains that are going to weave together that really are making high-speed transactions doable. And so it's coming. And on top of that new infrastructure, you're going to see all kinds of new businesses built. We saw it last year with NFTs. No one ever heard of an NFT. I talked about NFTs in 2013. Not one person looked like I was crazy. I said, well, at one point, if you think about Satoshi's brilliance, it was I took the first digital object that you couldn't counterfeit. Right? Bitcoin was the first private property on the internet. There was no private property on the internet before Bitcoin. It was a feudal system. That's why Facebook and Google and these feudal lords made all the money. Now I can have a unique digital object. It can be a unique digital Bitcoin, but it can also be a unique digital portrait of me, or a cool piece of art, or medical contract, or healthcare record. And so as we have these unique digital objects that are going to live in this world of blockchains, you're going to see new businesses built on top of them. Like, it's coming. The amount of world-class engineering talent that's leaving the Stanfords and the Caltechs and the Berkeleys and moving into this space is mind-boggling. I laugh that I couldn't get a job at my own firm if I look at my analysts who came in. And so, again, timing is everything as an investor. Is it going to happen this year? No. But you're going to see huge growth in gaming and the metaverse, really in these gaming communities. All of a sudden, you're going to have digital objects in sports, right? So soccer, baseball, basketball are all looking, how do I connect to this next generation audience in some metaverse? And what is a metaverse? Metaverse is your phone, it's a screen, it's a 3D. You can use lots of names for it, but I bet you if I took all your phones out, this guy's on his phone right here, you're 6 hours a day, right? Your kids are 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. People live on screens. Yeah. And so it's crazy to think if we're going to live on screens, you're not going to have private property on screen. And so the basic core principles are heading one direction. Now, as a practical guy, is there a lot of enthusiasm for buying crypto right now? No. And until the Fed slows down and the new narrative starts, it's going to go sideways. It's not going down anymore because everyone who needed to sell it sold it. Could it go down? Of course it could. But there's not a lot of activity in it. I would say activity is down by 75%, 80%. So that sucks when you run a business. I would also tell you that Citadel, BlackRock, Goldman, Citibank, in every big institution is spending a ton of money preparing for the next cycle, preparing for the tokenization of everything, where you tokenize stocks and tokenize bonds and tokenize real estate. So that they're preparing for the next surge of crypto and businesses that are built around blockchains. And so, Bank of New York Mellon announced yesterday they now got approval to do custody. And so for me as a business builder, I'm like, wow, that's great news as an asset owner. And it's scary as hell as a business owner. Like, who wants to compete against Ken Griffin in options market making? Anyone? 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 And so it's going to be a more competitive industry. But when you see all that money coming in, you realize that there's a put. There's an inevitability that the world will change. It is a better technology, therefore it will be adopted. It's instant settle, right? So all this 2-day clearing risk goes away. It's transparent. And even people say, well, how do you know? Right now it's used for North Korea financing. There will be KYC solutions on chain that are instant. And so while it costs so much money for banks to do KYC, once it's sorted out technologically, it will cost a fraction. And so I'm positive in the direction. Timing, you're going to have to take your own bet.
So you said something really interesting, though, that I wouldn't have expected you to say, given your noted affinity for Bitcoin. You mentioned Ethereum. You said it's probably going to win.
So they're different lanes. Bitcoin has the brand of store of value, like gold. There are 116, somebody Google, 116 elements on the periodic table, 114?
They keep adding to them, actually.
I think only one is valuable just because it's valuable, gold. Right? You can take all the gold in the history of the world, and it broadly fills this room. Russia's gold is this corner. The U.S.'s gold is that big corner. All the jewelry is maybe that corner. Scandinavia's, it's a ledger. Gold is a goddamn ledger. It's a blockchain. It sits in vaults. It sits in vaults all over the world. And people know, well, that's mine, right? Think about this. Let's take this room and move it to the middle of Central Park. It's all filled with gold. It's a $10 trillion sculpture. Like, how stupid is that? It only has value because we say it does. We made it our ledger. Bitcoin is becoming that ledger. It's not going away. Ethereum is going to become the tech play where the whole world gets built on top of. And it's going to get valued both on some speculative currency piece to it, but mostly on usage.
So I may disagree with you a little bit on that, because I would argue that the reason that we value gold is because King said we'll accept it in taxes, right? So this is a variant of this is how we accept it, this is what we'll take in form, et cetera. You came over to the Americas, gold was not money, it was decorative, right? But that brings up a really interesting point. You mentioned yesterday at the Robinhood conference that Sam Bankman-Fried now has speed dial to basically everybody in Congress. How do you think about the prospect of it being adopted in the political system? Are there enough proponents of it?
I don't think anybody listen, I was in the Army, I raised my right hand and swore to defend the Constitution and flew helicopters. I don't think any red-blooded American doesn't want the dollar to win. Like, the dollar is our strength. And so I go to bed cheering for the dollar every day. I am more worried about our stewardship than I ever was when I see 140 debt to GDP. And so I've got some of my money in Bitcoin, right, as a hedge. When I talk to policymakers, no one's talking about Bitcoin replacing the dollar. We are talking about stable coins or some version of digital dollars. It is a crying shame and a policy mistake that we are so far behind the Chinese. Think about what's happened from the last 50 years since the dollar's really been powerful. If you live in Lagos, Nigeria, and you're worried that your inflation rate is going to be 18% for the third year in a row, you're storing some of your wealth in $100 bills stashed in a pillow. If you live in Tanzania or Zimbabwe or Laos or Venezuela, right? There are more $100 bills overseas than there are dollar bills in circulation, right? The paper dollar was a store of wealth for people in crappy places that had bad stewardship. That is going to get replaced by something digital. And most people, if they had the choice, would take the digital dollar. If they don't have the choice, Bitcoin's a pretty nice, it's better than their local currency. The Chinese renminbi digital version, the crypto renminbi, is coming. If you go to Africa, if you go to the Mideast, if you go to South America, you see WeChat and Alipay signs everywhere. China has very big plans to make their digital renminbi part of their reserve currency plan. And right now we're sitting here still debating, well, should we allow? Like, it's insane. It's a national security threat. People in the security agencies get it. And in DC, they're starting to get it. And so I don't think stablecoins is funny because it's kind of the antithesis of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is like, oh, we don't trust the dollar. But the technology that enables Bitcoin enables stablecoins, instant payment around the world, instant settlement. Stablecoins is an unbelievably important technological breakthrough. Again, last year, there was $8 billion paid in overdrafts in U.S. banking. That all went to J.P. Morgan and Chase, and it all came from poor people. Right? It reminds me, when I was a young kid, my parents moved to Germany for a while when I was at college, and I'd go to Germany and I would call somebody and get out the phone, it's $3 a minute. You know, like long distance was this crazies if you picked up the phone, even to call out of state. If you grew up in a middle-class family that had no money, you got screamed at. Now calls are free. Yeah. Banking transaction costs for poor people, especially around the world, are immense. Yeah. It's up to 10% by the time Western Union gets your money back to the Philippines if you're a Filipino nurse in the US. That all should be free. And those rails are being built. It's already happening. 20% of remittances are now happening over crypto rails. And so this is happening. It's just not happening. And, you know, it was frustrating. I was debating Nuro Rubini yesterday, and he had a lot of interesting points, but then he was going on like a madman. Like, you have to have some nuance in this. Bitcoin has a role. That doesn't mean you don't think the dollar has a role, right? It's not an either or. It's a both.
Well, it's a really interesting point. I was going to bring up Nouriel, right? And I would argue generally that this certainty on either side, right? So you're saying a very different type of certainty. You're saying this is the direction. I don't know what's going to win, right? I don't care about the actual asset, but there is no question that we're moving towards a tokenized world, that we're moving towards crypto rails, that we're moving towards digital assets, that we're moving towards digital scarcity or the ability to have unique digital assets, signatures, et cetera, to the dynamic of it's all a scam, it's all garbage, et cetera, right? Like, only one of those can actually fractionally be true, right? It can't all be a scam.
No, it's not all a scam. You know, it's unfortunate. I used to stand in front of a crypto audience. I remember Ethereal 2016, which was this big conference in California. I stood there because I'm always the oldest guy in the room in crypto. You might think I look young, but I'm the oldest guy in the room in crypto. And I was like, guys, you have to self-regulate, or it's going to cost the whole industry, and you're going to get regulated. And, you know, looking back, the industry did a horrific job of self-regulating. Companies like Celsius and, you know, Voyager and Three Arrows Capital are stains on the whole industry. I would like to see some of those guys, you know, in an alley. You know, my daughter said that's toxic masculinity, so I shouldn't say that.
You were a wrestler. I accept it.
Again, it is so frustrating in that these are actually not on-chain companies. They were centralized companies that dealt with crypto, and they were run by guys who turned out to have very little ethics, either really stupid or really little ethics. And that's unfortunate. And I do think you need some regulation. Like in the Celsius example, or BlockFi, or Voyager, they were taking consumer deposits. Give me your Bitcoin, give me your stablecoin, I'll pay you an interest rate. I'm sure in the fine print it told the consumer, you're taking their credit risk, but no one was talking, hey, you're lending me your money and I'm now going to leverage it 30 times. You're lending it overnight, but I'm going to invest long term. And so you had the classic, how do you blow up the world, asset liability mismatch and too much leverage. Right? Those should not have been allowed. Those are non-bank banks. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have a regulatory framework. Listen, the crazies in some ways in my mind was the SEC was in both their offices and didn't do a goddamn thing. I'm saying, oh, the SEC is they get a D in my job, right? Like, if your job is to protect the consumer, you failed in those cases and you failed with the Grayscale Trust. And so it's been frustrating as heck that we've been so slow to have a regulatory environment that makes sense and works. And I know it's not easy, and I know people are working on it, but we're slow and it's costing, you know, jobs overseas. Listen, we're opening a Bahamas office because we can do stuff there that we can't do here. And it's that And we take things so conservatively. We wouldn't do a token, and we have a whole process that costs us a fortune just to say, okay, we think this token's not a security, and we've got these law firms that think it as well. It'd be a whole lot easier if they made the rules a little clearer.
So that's actually a great point, which is the general failure of regulation to provide the clear guidance, et cetera, right? On the flip side of that, one of the, you mentioned Satoshi and the ethos behind it, et cetera. One of the things that I encountered as I interfaced with the community was anytime a fraud was uncovered, it was, oh, well, if they just read the fine print, right? People need to be responsible for this, et cetera. Not dissimilar to overdrafts from JP Morgan, for all intents and purposes, right? This is a tax that is being leveled by various forms of criminality, obfuscation, et cetera, on the system. As we reduce that with regulation, what do you think is going to happen? Is it the JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachs of the world that are going to dominate this in the next cycle? Or are there companies in the crypto space
listen,
that are going to
I hope so, on the second answer.
Yeah.
Listen, Goldman and JP will have a role to play.
Yep.
Right? They are trusted stewards of people's capital. And so for them to understand the space, believe in the space, and then advocate for their clients to come in is a good thing, not a bad thing. Will they innovate fast enough? Will things move on change fast enough? It's hard to be big and innovate.
Yep.
And once people start trusting blockchains more trusting on chain and see how it works, it will become easy. It has to be like the back of the TV. I always say, when you watch the TV, no one knows how the goddamn thing works. We love the TV, got great programs on it, but there's not a person in here who can tell me how the damn thing works, right? We just get used to it. Like at one point, the interface to this decentralized world has to feel easy. Mm-hmm. Jeff Bezos was giving out $100 million gifts to philanthropists, or to activists. And he gave one to my friend Van Jones. And Van was thinking about blockchain-based voting, right? We have a voting system in the United States that the left doesn't trust and the right doesn't trust, right? The left says they're not counting them fairly, and the right says, well, they have all these people that shouldn't be voting that are voting. So could you use blockchain to help in that? And I was like, Van, I got a good idea. Let's start with American Idol, right? Let's teach people how the system works, like voting on something that doesn't matter that much, unless you're a huge Idol fan. It's going to take time for people to understand how this works, and then it will just become part of the fabric.
Well, you hit on something, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to actually invite you in to speak with us, right? Because you mentioned this issue of much of the fraud has occurred from people who are just morally dubious, right? And I think one of the challenges that the space is experiencing right now is a confusion between people who are enthusiastic about the opportunities like yourself and those who are morally dubious in their undertakings, right? I mean, I've dealt with you for many years. I've found you to be morally upright and outstanding and always enthusiastic about whatever you're working on,
That's
right?
true.
So radically different perspective. If we were to change pace completely and talk about some of the challenges, you mentioned nutrition, weight gain, et cetera. You've done a ton of philanthropy. We're here for a philanthropic cause. What are some of the things that you're passionate about outside of crypto as you look to the next generation? And what do you think needs to change beyond voting for American Idol?
Yeah, no. So, I started in like sports philanthropy. I set this thing called Beat the Streets Up, which got kids to wrestle in now 200 schools in New York and 13 cities. And it was, how do you create leaders? I then end up getting right into the middle of the criminal justice space. We have a absurd criminal justice system in America. It is broken, it is unethical, it's unfair, it's mean-spirited, and it's uneconomical. And so, like, how do you make change there? And that has been a huge effort in time. And the first thing you do when you want to learn something, you go visit. And so I would advocate to anyone, go visit a prison, and you learn a ton. And so now I have gospel brunches on the weekend. I'll have 4 or 5 guys that spent 15, 20, 30 years in prison, which meant they were in for pretty horrific crimes, and you'd let them babysit your grandkids. Like, you learn that people deserve second chances and that people aren't their worst moment. And so that's probably been the most powerful philanthropy journey. I always felt like the more you give, the more you get. Like, all the cool things I do in my life come from my philanthropy at this point. I actually marched in the opening ceremonies with Kobe Bryant in 2012, not because I was such a great athlete, but because I did a lot for wrestling, and I liked Kobe. And so I keep thinking like this idea that the more you give, the more you get. And so for me, it's criminal justice. It's now democracy reform. Like we have a broken democracy, and so we've been funding things like open primaries and ranked choice voting and in ways to get the center to have a voice. And the third thing, like our third vertical is healing. And healing through psychedelics, healing through other means. There's a revolution going on. I actually invested as a for-profit investor, the first investor in psilocybin as a mental health therapy in a company called Compass Pathways, and then did one called Thai. Both are NASDAQ listed. They were worth a lot more last year than this year, but they're amazing companies. And I would tell you that within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you will have MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, ketamine's already approved, all approved by the FDA, insurance paying for. And these are therapies of unbelievable power in helping people through their trauma and in helping people through mental health. Right? We have these huge mental health crises going on, partly because of this nervous and disjointed world. When you go into prison, every single person in there is traumatized. 97% of women in prison have been raped before they got into prison. That's trauma. Forget why they're in prison, being re-traumatized. So you have this unbelievably traumatized population, and mostly we're just re-traumatizing them. And so the idea is, can you create scalable healing solutions for people? Like the guys I said that are at my Sunday brunch, they found a way to heal, usually through education, through some, some different programs that were in some of the jails, but those are tiny, tiny pockets. We send 10 million people a year into jail. 10 million. They stay an average of 49 days. 2 million is the current population that's kind of stable. 500,000 waiting for their trial. 1.5 million more long term. But 10 million people a year to go through. And so there's this giant trauma machine that just goes and goes and doesn't stop. And so that, when I put those three things together, that's where I run out of energy after that.
So it's fascinating. I had the opportunity to interview Christian Angermeyer, who's with Atai and Compass. And one of the more interesting things about this is that this is not a, hey, I love to use drugs sort of dynamic, right? This is actually genuinely about trauma. You mentioned trauma and the role that it plays in things like incarceration, the role that it plays in terms of failure to fully participate in society, et cetera. When you think about our financial system, to change back to that direction, it feels like trauma that we've been through. It honestly feels, I mean, I even hear you talk about it, right? And the dynamics of, well, if somebody believes in it, then it's true, right? It does feel like we've lost a grounding.
Yeah.
Is there a way back in terms of, you mentioned the trust, blockchain reveals what has actually transpired. I encounter dynamics on a very regular basis. I put out a tweet yesterday after Steve Cohen at Robinhood said, everybody's really depressed. Everybody seems really underallocated. He was talking about his portfolio managers. And the response that I got back on Twitter shocked me, right? I mean, I would think if Steve Cohen's saying this, like people would be like, oh, that's interesting. Can you give me some more details around it? The vast majority of people are like,
the Mets.
Yeah, screw the Mets. He's trying to sell his book. He is, trying to escape. He's trapped, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, first of all, I assure you that Steve Cohen is not trapped. But there's this nihilistic behavior that exists right now.
Tribalistic and nihilistic.
Great, yeah.
I had a weird call yesterday. I got a call from a guy named Tony Bobolinsky. And if you're a Fox News watcher, you might remember him as the guy that worked with Hunter Biden and had all the emails that said the big guy's getting paid. Tony was a Naval Academy grad, wrestler. I hadn't seen him in 7, 8 years. He used to come to wrestling meets and would, buy a table at the club. He made some money and try to be a good guy. And he reached out to me. I was like, this is really weird why he's reaching out. But so I met him because I was curious. And he was begging me for help. I thought he was going to beg for how do I get out of this mess? No. He was begging me for help because I have all these facts that Biden did all these crimes. And Fox plays them, and CNN won't even put them on. Like, no one believes me, and they're true, and it's the truth. And I was like, well, Tony, you're in the middle of this political mess, and the Democrats are saying the same time, like Trump gets away with all this shit, and so like it's terrible. But as the conversation went on and on, I realized we have these two different truths in the world that don't speak to each other. And he was literally like, he put one down on the CNN website and Googled his name, and nothing comes up. Now, if you Google Pavlinsky, CNN, then there's tons of things. But if you go to the CNN website, nothing comes up. And it was like, how do we shut one voice out on the left and another voice out on the right? And because I'm certainly more progressive than he is, he was hoping I could get him on CNN. And I was like, I don't think I have that much pull. But this is it's a tragedy that's going on. You see it in crypto. A lot of these small, lesser crypto communities, right? They have money involved. They have an ethos. They have a story. If it can be Bitcoin, why can't it be, Cardano? Kid you not, if I today tweet, I think Cardano trades like hell and it's going down, I will literally get hundreds of violent and ugly messages, and Novogratz is stupid. I will get death threats. I've had more death threats from the Cardano community or the XRP community because they think I'm, a threat to their tribe. And so it's very unhealthy. It was the same thing with GameStop. When the GameStop went on and they were accusing Stevie, I actually went and tried to put a nice, listen, Stevie's not my best friend, but I know him, and he's not profiting by, right. I literally had to take the tweet back because I was just getting attacked. And so it's scary. And I don't know what changes it. We need new leadership. What worries me is, on the right, if Trump runs, God forbid us all, but even if DeSantis runs, I had lunch with DeSantis and he was asked, what would you do if you get elected to heal the country? And he looked dead serious and he said, well, I'd have to convince all the Democrats they're just wrong and dumb. And I was like, you didn't just say that. You literally didn't just say that. And so we haven't had a leader that can bring us to the middle for a while. Yeah. We have a primary system that pulls people to the edges. And the crazy part is, I own a company called Bojangles, or I own a big chunk of it, which is a fast food chicken restaurant. And so we have our annual event in Nashville one year. And you go there and you start with the Pledge of Allegiance and then you say a prayer. You're like, okay, this is different than New York. America's a pretty decent, wholesome center-right country. Mm-hmm. That's who we are as a people. And yet our politics have pulled us into this really bad place, which I don't know how we get back from, but we need to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an extraordinary environment. I had a very similar experience with the crypto community where any negative statement was basically, it introduced me to the block component, right, which I'd never used before. And there is a general skepticism of anyone actually making a statement of good intent, forceful intent, whatever. It's what is your book? What are you trying to sell, et cetera. I don't know the way out either. You did hit on one thing there that I think is actually really powerful, which is this general idea of the next generation of leadership, or who are the next leaders. You mentioned meeting with DeSantis. You highlighted, hopefully not Trump. Is there anyone on the Democrat side, or is there anyone that you see?
Listen, Pete Buttigieg, if he hadn't taken 4 months paternity leave, I think that's just going to be an anchor on his neck. He's growing up. He is awesome on his feet. He's a very decent guy. He's thoughtful and he's smart. I don't think he flies because of that. Yeah. Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker has grown a lot in the last 4 years. I had dinner with him 4 years ago. He wasn't ready. He again, I don't know if he flies either. He might be too progressive for. We're a center-right country, that I'm sure of, and I'm not. I'm center left to progressive, but when I travel the country, I get who we are. I was in the military, and so, but we're not also a MAGA country, right? And so, how we get back there, my son actually was like, Dad, it's so depressing. I can't think of one guy I want to pick. Yeah. And so you're hoping somebody shows up. They're decent people out there, but in our politics, I don't see who takes DeSantis down. Is either going to be him or Trump. And I think every Democrat I know prays that Biden doesn't run again. But who takes his place,
is unknown.
It's unknown.
It's really hard. It's really, really hard. Well, hopefully this conversation, was an opportunity for you to talk about your enthusiasm for the space. I intentionally brought you in, exactly as I said, because I know that you are actually a really intensely passionate but unfailingly honest individual. I've really, really enjoyed listening to you talk about your vision of crypto in the future, and I think our audience actually is probably feeling the exact same thing. Mike, I know you have to get back to your office. You've got things that you got to do. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, and I really look forward to continuing to talk with you about these subjects.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.